Thanks everybody for joining us today. I know it's already been a big day with a lot of topics covered. I think that the role that I'm bringing is, having worked, so just from my background, I've been working with people that have been impacted by trauma for about 30 years now. And over that time, have sort of seen the way in which trauma just can have this multiplicity effect. And I think the last few years has led to a very substantial rethink about some aspects of understanding of trauma and understanding the risk of trauma. And one of those is this notion of moral injury that has been resonating across the day. And I think there's others. In fact, I've identified sort of 6 core things that have just changed the way we think about trauma, and then ultimately how we respond to trauma. And I'll touch base on those as we go through today. But I just sort of might begin with just how amazing we are as human beings, the things that allow us to be able to survive and adapt in situations of extreme adversity and extreme trauma. And the journey to try to understand that really began at the end of the experience of the Vietnam veterans returning. And they returned to a terrible situation, in fact, where there was no recognition of the possible injuries they had. It had even been left out of the current psychiatric system when they came back. So access to compensation, access to validation of the injury was all removed. And they had to fight really for validation that they shouldn't just be okay after experiencing the things that they've experienced. And their work then led to this really, now 40-year intense science journey where there've been, close to 80,000 research studies trying to understand what is the intersection between humans and trauma. And slowly we've put pieces together about, one, how remarkable we are in the systems that are built inside of us that allow us to become more and more effective, more and more capable of doing trauma work. And this is the very set of characteristics that allows our first responders to be so effective. These systems inside of us, they become more tuned, more calibrated. And we actually know, even from the neuroscience, that the trauma that we've experienced in life, it's not just harmful, actually it optimizes our whole capacity, our whole system to be responsive. Probably the other really big lesson that we've learned over time is the more trauma we are faced with and we have to deal with, the more likely everybody is to sustain an injury. It's almost got very little to do with the person. Once upon a time, we used to even think that, people that perhaps are in more vulnerable positions might be more likely to get it. But it really does seem to be the amount of trauma that we encounter just can place us at greater injury. Over time, we think other things make it more likely to occur, like the operational tempo. Is there a time for people to slow down? Is there a time for people to recover? Or is this relentless conveyor belt of trauma that can't be properly processed and can't be put away? The other thing I think that we've begun to learn, and this is where moral injury comes into this picture, and I'll try to give a picture of what is moral injury and how does it fit into our overall understanding. Now, many of us will know about PTSD. And PTSD is, we'll hear about it. We mightn't know too much details about it, but the research is very clear. PTSD is an outcome of trauma. And when we look at the injury outcomes for our first responders, for our military services, they really are extraordinary, and very worrying, in fact. The kind of traumatic stress injuries that we're seeing are very difficult in those groups. And we're seeing, them having an enormous impact, and the price of service we're realizing is very high, and we're not able to prevent it. We used to always think that this was about the threat to life. But probably as we look beyond that and start to look at the real systems involved, you know, we've got things that happen to us in trauma places. Some of it is danger and some of it is fear. And of course, things can happen that undermine our confidence that we're safe. And that probably places us at risk of PTSD. But we also have amazing systems inside of us that alert us to things going wrong. You know, any one of us, when we encounter something that just makes us so angry because there's been such an injustice, that's using this trauma system we've begun to realize. You know, when we feel the incredible burden of responsibility and small things can have catastrophic outcomes, we have systems inside of us that alert us to that designed to help us. I mean, what we know is all of these trauma systems are designed to help us, but they can get injured. And the injury is very, you know, when we're talking about injury in this place, I really am using it, you know, quite literally as being very similar to a kind of musculoskeletal injury. Unfortunately, just like that, often the road to recovery is a lot of rehabilitation, you know, of, you know, being able to gradually build up strength again. And people need safe places to do that. So this is a risk that we all have. Moral injury, like PTSD, is something that can happen where our moral systems that get triggered in the face of trauma get triggered so intensely and so overwhelmingly, we get almost frozen in the alarm systems that are built inside of us. And we all have alarm systems in life. We have an alarm system to tell us when we haven't measured up to our own moral standards. We have alarm systems when we see somebody behaving appallingly. We have alarm systems when we see something that is horrible beyond belief. And these alarm systems are there to keep us safe, to help us be able to recognize things that we have to do. But when you move these alarm systems into trauma work, into being right at the very edge of our resources and our capability, then these alarms designed to help us can turn into injuries. And rather than initiate a restorative process where we actually take our power back, because all of the trauma approaches inside of us as people are ultimately about giving us power. They're about taking responsibility. They're about dealing with injustice. They're about removing danger. And then the system is meant to wind down. And all of these terms like PTSD and moral injury are essentially just describing when this wonderful supportive system inside of us gets overwhelmed and gets injured and isn't able to turn itself off when we're safe or when the issues have been resolved. And because they're so powerful inside of us, then they really can have a big impact on our lives. So this is the kind of issue that brings us here today about the burden of this, because we're actually seeing these levels of injury escalating in our frontline workers, in people that are constantly putting themselves on the line. Now, I can take you back to situations in the past, in World War II, where injury rates were also extraordinarily high. So it's got nothing to do with people not being as strong or as really resilient in any of that. In fact, my observation over 30 years of practice is often the people who have PTSD or moral injury are the people that put themselves out there and are really, you know, taking on the responsibility. And it is that process that gets an injury, just like an elite athlete who pushes themselves is the one that's most likely to get, you know, an injury to the musculoskeletal system. So there's no reason for shame with any of this. In fact, you know, I get to work with men and women from all of the first responder groups, from, you know, our veteran community, and it is inspiring work to work with them and to know what they've done, and to recognize this as a legitimate injury that in no way tanks them, but is just often the cost of their service. So how do we approach this dilemma of keeping people well and safe? The one thing we do know is we can't prevent these injuries yet. We don't know how to prevent them. The trauma load that a person experiences as that increases the risk to these injuries increase. But there is one really important framework that is extraordinarily important, and this is a framework they call the conservation of resources. And we know that what keeps people well and keeps them strong is our resources in life aren't depleted. You know, if we're having so many efficiency gains that there's just no reservoirs available to people, when we're put in situations of extraordinary stress, then, you know, we start to actually have to dig deep in a way that places us at risk. You know, often preparedness is a key issue when we're in a situation of unfolding trauma. That is the very worst time to find a solution. Preparedness, having plans in place, protect everybody, because when we're in trauma spaces, we don't have the cognitive resources available to solve problems. That should have all been done in the past as much as possible, and we should just be activating plans. To solve problems in the face of trauma is to assemble resources that aren't available, and that means that we have to use enormous effort to assemble those resources. So this theory, this conservation of resources theory, is just very helpful for us to begin to understand of how we keep people well and what happens to all of us when our resources start to deplete. We all go into a very defensive and reactionary mode. And of course, in a leadership way, this can be misunderstood as resistance or people being stubborn. It's a natural, predictable outcome when people are overwhelmed and placed under stress. At that point, they don't need to be challenged, they need to be supported. You know, and it's sometimes at those places where we can sort of see, well, we need to performance manage these issues. You know, in fact, one of the very odd observations about the trauma space is that sometimes as people are beginning to get injured, it's almost invisible for the colleagues that are working with them. It would be invisible in the workplace, because the first signs often that we're not doing well is at home. It's because we're able to function in a trauma space because that's where the injury is. It's like a typing to trauma, but we can't downregulate it to reconnect with everyday life. So it's invisible. So often the early signs here are invisible. And you get this odd experience of presenteeism, of people actually taking on more responsibility because they can feel, you know, that at least they're successful at work because they're not able to downregulate these trauma systems that are meant to help us but can get injured. And so you can see this terrible thing begin to happen. People take on more responsibility, but that's actually sometimes a sign that they're injured. And then the injury means they become less and less flexible, more and more reactionary. And that can be the very time where we start to put more pressure on them to be adaptive, to be flexible. And it sets people up for a terrible disconnection with the very place where they most need their resources from. So maintaining resources in a community, maintaining resources in a team, maintaining balance in life in a team are all extraordinarily important in our lives, even in the midst of responding to critical incidences. And this sort of brings to probably another really useful framework to begin to understand how, how we can stay as well as we can in the face of chronic responsiveness to challenges and to trauma, which our first responder and military community do. But, as we've seen over recent years, communities are facing wave after wave after wave of, extreme adversity and setback. And a very dear colleague and mentor of mine, Derek Steel, whose own work involved working with communities often coming out of the most horrendous periods of war and genocide. How do you build goodness and wellness in a community that has been so ripped apart and destroyed? And he identified these 5 fundamental pillars. And I think these pillars are actually foundational pillars for individuals, for families, and for communities and societies. And the pillars are around safety. We're all designed to try to create safety. And safety is just, we can't move in the world with no safety. It's never absolute. We never have absolute safety, but some level of safety is critical. Our relations to each other, our attachments and bonds, we as human beings, regardless of whether we believe it or not, we are created by our networks of connections, and we are held by our connections across time. And they're a foundational pillar of everybody's individual lives, of our community and our society. Our roles and identity are so critical. In traditional societies, often these were very clear for everybody. In our modern world, it's much more complicated, and young people trying to find their roles and identity, it's such a difficult journey. But when we get injured and our whole identity and a role is taken from us, this can be extraordinarily impactful on us. One thing that I think really sets apart the model that Steel presented is the need for justice. Justice is also this foundational pillar for all of us. And if, all of us have the experience of injustice and just how much that burns us up. There's never absolute justice, and nothing can fully restore things that have been taken from us. But justice is critical. We can't abandon it. We can't let it go. And then, in this model that Derek Steel proposed, all of those 4 pillars help to make that very final pillar, which is the pillar where we have that sense of meaning and purpose and coherence in life. Now, trauma actually smashes all of these pillars, So if we wanted to look at just mapping some of these things, PTSD instantly destroys a sense of safety, and generally moral injury creates a sense of injustice, the lack of justice, the good world, whether that can be, whether there's goodness and, any more in the world. And often when we get stuck in either, a PTSD injury or a moral injury, we get stuck looking through the world through that entire lens, and these other things which are so critical to life around our attachments and our bonds, our roles and identity and our meaning and purpose get lost. And, this is what makes life so difficult. When I work with people who have PTSD, almost universally, the one thing everybody with PTSD wants is a shack in the bush with no access roads, and there they feel they'll find peace. But of course, it's a prison. It's not balanced. And moral injury is the cold justice. We may perpetually be looking at those who have betrayed us and become consumed with embitterment and anger, and that just poisons our life, because there's no access to goodness and to the attachments and love and support that all of us need. So I think this is the worst thing about these types of injuries, is how they prevent us from investing in these other pillars in our lives. But those pillars also tell us so much, because that allows us to do a wellness check. You know, sure, we may be just working so well in creating safety and rescuing everybody and on a giant mission, but how are our other pillars? Are we finding ways to invest in our attachments and bonds, to trust people and to link with people? You know, are we exploring new ways to, to have a role and have an identity, and not to lock it down into one singular thing that, if it's taken from us, leaves us totally bereft? So when you bring these two things together, the ADAPT model and the conservation of resources framework, it's a really good way for us to begin to think of, how do we collectively stay well and healthy? How do we support our people in times of adversity? How do we make sure we're balanced in what we bring to our team? And how do we calibrate our understanding of people's capacity to what's actually happening to them? So often than not, in our modern day community and society, people making key decisions outside of the trauma context are assuming it's a normal world, are making decisions like, well, these are the performance standards that everybody needs to achieve. That has no meaning in a trauma world, where we're doing what it takes to survive, and we need people to back us up and to protect us and to support us. So changing and adapting our management and leadership style to give people top cover, to support them, to make them feel held, seems to be critical to protecting them. One of the things that's very interesting and probably distressing, if we look at our, men and women who have served in the military, one of the things that perhaps been one of the greatest challenges of recent times is the erosion of, rules of engagement sometimes. But these protect people in times of extraordinary adversity. I've had the great honor, really, I suppose, to work so closely with many of our veterans. And it's amazing that out of just about everybody I ever work with, they're the one group that are trained in ethics, because ethics protects us in the trauma world. They're the things that help us to stay safe. And when those crumble or aren't available to us, we become at risk. And then it's so easy to hold people accountable. And accountability is very challenging in these situations. We know from, the research into, crash investigations in the airline industry, and also medically adverse events in high critical hospital events. As soon as you bring a faults-based investigation process, basically injuries multiply. What we need to do is create opportunities to learn, to understand from things that have gone wrong, but to keep the actors who have already, put so much on the line safe. And why that can't ever be absolute, and there has to be some level of accountability, the principle is critical of creating safe bonds and safe connections, rather than processes that fragment those things. And ourselves as leaders in the field, are we showing balance? And of course it all has to be proportionate. In a time of emergency, we need to be there, we need to be available, we need to be on call. But as soon as practical, to be able to demonstrate to people the need to return to living, to return to balance, to return to investment in attachments and bonds in non-trauma work. Because it's the hardest thing to leave the trauma space. It's comfortable because it kept us safe in times of extraordinary danger. It's just terribly well, it's not useful for non-trauma space. And it takes time and a lot of hard work to be able to bring us back home after trauma work. And so much of our trauma work these days, people are abandoning the journey back home and left alone with it, or left in a fragmented system that lacks coherence. So both as communities, as leaders, and as frontline workers, the journey home from trauma is as much and as hard and as challenging as the journey of preparation to be effective in these spaces. And we all need a lot of support. When you look at the great history of time in this space, this abandonment of those who do trauma work is extraordinary. You know, we saw after World War I and the identification of shell shock, the term almost disappeared from the medical literature until World War II popped up, and then suddenly it was rediscovered and redescribed as combat fatigue. And it was so much forgotten after World War II that they wrote out of the psychiatric system even the recognition of the damaging effects of trauma. And there's so many accounts of us leaving people behind, and so many of those that I work with feel abandoned, feel severed, and feel cut off after their work of service. And sometimes that's because we don't know how to reach out to those who are injured. You know, the nature of the injury often makes people feel with anger and embitterment and rage because they're the systems that are damaged, but they're damaged doing the work to protect us all. So often we might, you know, in a normal space, we'd just say, oh, it's that behavior is terribly inappropriate. But in a trauma-informed framework, we see these things differently and we see people's behavior differently. So we have enough knowledge now to do things better, to work with those people that have separated from us, to create restorative and reconciliation practices, to try to connect with them. And often in my clinical work, I talk about this. The person who has the responsibility to heal is the one with the power. The one without the power is not able to do anything. And often, once you're injured, you don't have the power. And their journey is taking their power back, not actually having it taken away. So restorative and reconciliation practices, even if we feel like we've done nothing wrong, are critical because we need to listen to their voices and not, you know, shy away from the tone they're spoken into and the anger they're cried out at. And so often I find working with people in that setting that just to be able to be present and to recognize the goodness and the strength in people, even if they're filled with injury and rage, is so important. So, you know, this whole understanding of trauma and the way in which, one, as humans, we've got these incredible systems that actually allow us to do this work and to be extraordinarily effective and to really do amazing work, but how they can be damaged and we can carry this injury, both in PTSD, but also in these extreme emotions, which are totally overwhelming. There's things we can do to minimize it, to keep ourselves as well as possible, to do wellness checks. And then if people have become injured, to create restorative and reconciliation practices so they're not left behind, they don't feel cut off and they don't feel abandoned. And we find ways to hold those people who have become injured in the work that we do. So this is our big challenge. And, you know, if we were to do a test of how we're going, I think we're left wanting at the moment. We've got a long way to go. We're spending a lot of money, but it's not being delivered wisely or coherently or creating the outcomes we want for those who have been injured in this work. But there's really good information. We've learnt so much and we know so much more. So hopefully through the talking today and through some of the discussion here, we can create systems and connections that reach out to each other. So.
Thank you, Zach. My goodness. I've got a couple of questions which I'm sure are other people's thought process. So what you're saying is it is not possible not to be impacted by trauma. It's the amount of trauma that one is exposed to over a continuum. Is that what I take out of it?
Trauma is always transformative, you know. We can't go through trauma and not be changed. Even if we're not injured, we know more about the world now than we knew before. And in fact, our brain becomes optimized. We see it happen, you know. For people who are been through trauma, they respond to situations much quicker because their body is primed for it. That's the systems inside of us. So actually, when we look through the neuroscience at trauma, people with huge amounts of trauma in their life and no injury, their brains look very similar to people with PTSD. It's just a small difference. So trauma transforms us. But that doesn't have to be bad, you know. Often it can, you know, it's this injury that's the terrible thing.
Yeah.
An injury isn't absolutely necessary, but we have no way to prevent it yet.
So picking up that point, no way of preventing it, you're actually saying there's no way like a physical injury that you can catch yourself and say, whoa, I need to step back and look at, you know, my life. It'll
There
happen.
are certainly some early signs, and it's really good to pick them up early. You know, when we find ourselves being unable, you know, having PTSD symptoms like nightmares, intrusions and things like that, that's all pretty normal actually. That doesn't even tell you much. I mean, if they're really big, it's problematic, but we actually know that those symptoms just occur when we're doing trauma work, because that's just part of our normal internal system. It's when they don't cease after an event, when they're not down regulating, or when we find ourselves pulling away from the balance across those 5 pillars. And we're just investing everything in work because that's the only place we feel functionally effective. They're the signs that maybe we've got an injury we're not recognizing. And it's hard to pick this injury because it's like, you know, how do you ask a fish to describe water? If you're doing trauma work, you don't know you're injured. It's often other people that recognize it.
Absolutely. So what you're saying, with all the money that we're putting into prevention and mental health awareness, we're actually only skimming the surface. We're not having deep enough conversations, particularly in business, in organizations, that we need to bring forward to our leaders and not delegate it to a safety expert or whatever. It needs to become a whole of organization understanding.
It seems to be very important, and being disconnected from family or the place of the injury and to be left behind just seems to make the journey much harder. It's very hard to stay connected. So, you know, I think we're in the point of how do we support those who have been injured, but without cutting them off, because the cutting off seems to be a big part of the challenge of being abandoned and lost and rendered powerless. I mean, one of the greatest ironies, I think, is we've created these incredible injury management systems, you know, and they were hard fought for across time. You can go back, you know, 200 years when they were absent, and it was horrifying. People would, you know, go through workplace injuries and there'd be no accountability, you know. So these have been hard fought for, but they're meant to help, but they turn into a bureaucratic system which is experienced as alienating and isolating. And because we don't want them to be rorted, we test everything. And of course, when you're injured, that just invalidates you. So the very systems that we create to support people and nurture them inadvertently poisons them.
So I guess the last question is something you said very early on, and that was about our Vietnam vets, which is often talked about when we talk about PTSD and moral injury. But given that the community, all of us have been through trauma after trauma after trauma, and we're all exhausted, the vets there seemed to be a tide turning when we had the Welcome Home marches, the validation, the public acknowledgement that they were important. Do you feel, and it can be regarded as tokenism as well, but it really was, they fought hard to have that acknowledgement themselves. Do you feel as a community, instead of pushing us forward and life's going back to normal, we need something to validate what people have been through to help them move forward and process the trauma?
When you come from a trauma space, it's very hard to come back to the community because the community can't understand. You've got those great Greek tragedies that show this as well. The return is hard. It's a difficult thing. And that coming home needs to be seen as much of a thing that involves training and support and mentoring as the preparing to go. And just for some reason as a society, we put everything into the preparing to go, and we just magically think the coming home will be unproblematic. It's not. It's not unproblematic. It is an enormous challenge. And maybe if we were to create that as a collective experience and one where people are supported and not just having to find their own way. We live in a very individualistic society where everybody is entitled to their own freedom and their own journeys in life. But when you're injured and you don't have any cognitive resources, you just get lost. And that's what's happening to so many people. So the coming home, that needs to be a part of it.
Yeah. Okay. And just to give our business leaders some timeline and understanding, recovery from PTSD and indeed moral injury is not like that, is it? It's a long journey.
Well, and it depends on the different types. There's another recent development called complex PTSD, and we're finding this to be much more common amongst our first responder community than we thought. We thought it would only be for hostage survivors, people in long-term situations of imprisonment, kids exposed to horrendous long-term family abuse, torture survivors. But actually, it's just trauma work. And so if your career is trauma work, you seem to sometimes get these more severe outcomes. And it's a big journey of recovery. And recovery is not a wonderful term here. I think it's more about bringing back power and taking back control of your life, because the trauma's got into the driver's seat and you need to get it out and get back in yourself. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of retraining and a lot of support to do it. Just like when we're recovering from a major injury, we've got, ages and ages of therapy and physiotherapy and training. And the harder we work, the better the outcome, But the harder we work often is because people are there supporting us and pushing us and giving us that, because we don't have those resources. It's exactly the same from trauma.
Well, thank you, Zach. That was just a wonderful rounding of our discussion today, and I hope everyone got a lot out of it. I might just pick up on Derek, is it Silov? S-I-L?
Derek Silov, yes, and his ADAPT model.
Right.
And, I use that very often because I think in terms of guidance to recovery when you're injured, it makes so much more sense than terms like PTSD and moral injury. It's about how do I bring back balance and start investing in the other parts of my life that I can't even see because I'm so focused on trauma.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.